Hi, good evening, everyone. Such a delight to welcome you all here tonight to the Museum of the City of New York. My name is Whitney Donhauser, and I'm the Ronay Menschel Director here. So we are very excited to present on the front lines of reproductive rights with Faye Wattleton, the former president of Planned Parenthood and one of New York's and the nation's most influential activists for women's rights and health care. So tonight is the second event in our series, Who Controls Women's Health? A Century of Struggle, which we are honored to co-present with the New York Academy of Medicine for the third year in a row this series. And this free series is made possible by a grant from Humanities New York, and we're so grateful for their support and to allow us this collaboration for our two organizations. So we hope to see you on October 5th at the third and final talk in the series, More Than Medicine, Social Justice and Feminist Movements for Health, with historian Jennifer Nelson at the Academy of Medicine. And you, of course, can look on our website and register at mcny.org and /women's health. So tonight's program, and indeed the whole series, is particularly meaningful for us here at the museum, because on October 11th, we will be opening Beyond Suffrage, a century of women in New York politics, which is an exhibition that traces New York political activism in the city from the suffrage movement through the 21st century. So it's really a trailblazing, it's about trailblazing women in New York who joined the political fray in the generations after suffrage. So, and one of the leading demands and goals of so many female activists over the decades has been about reproductive rights and access to birth control and health care. So this has been one of the most contested and bitterly disputed areas of women's activists, really beyond the suffrage movement. So we are additionally we're additionally honored to welcome Faye Wattleton, who agreed to serve on our Beyond Suffrage Honorary Exhibition Committee led by Gloria Steinem. And we hope that many of you will return to the museum to see this exhibition, and we have a lot of accompanying programs. So tonight's program features a lecture by Ms. Wattleton, and then a brief interview with Dr. Marcela Micucci, the Andrew W. Mellon Fellow here. And then we'll have and Marcela is also part of our curatorial team who's been working on the Beyond Suffrage exhibition. So after their conversation, we'll follow with question and answers, and we'll have mics available for all of you. So, and I guess we would like you to wait for the mic to be held rather than just sort of blurting out your questions. So so now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Lisa O'Sullivan, Vice President and Director of the Academy of Medicine Library, who will introduce the speakers after that. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry, that's part of the price we pay for collaboration, is that you have to hear both of us speak. But good evening, and thank you all for being there. And Whitney, thank you for your remarks. This, as you can imagine, is also an incredibly important series for the Academy, as we are an organisation that since 1847 has worked towards the well-being of people in cities in New York and beyond. So women's health is a really important underpinning to all of the work we do today in our policy and research. As Whitney mentioned, I am director of the library, and we hold a vast collection of materials relating to women's health as well. We're actually open to the public, so I welcome anyone who wants to come and explore our collections to look up nyam.org and learn more. So it's always exciting to come across the road, and these are great collaborations. I think they really show the overlapping interests that both organizations have about generating conversations around critical issues of importance to New Yorkers. And I really want to add my thanks to both the museum, my colleagues here, and Humanities New York, who have really seen the value in what we do. I'm also delighted that this evening the Academy's new as of last week president, Dr. Judith Salerno, is here in the audience. And Dr. Salerno herself has a distinguished career in women's health, and we're very happy to welcome her to the Academy and to New York. And she's just there if you want to say hello after the event. So on to our speakers. I promised we would get there. Our first speaker tonight is Faye Wattleton, who will discuss the role of Planned Parenthood in debates over female reproductive autonomy. Ms. Wattleton was president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America from 1978 to 1992. She is the author of the book Life on the Line and now serves as managing director with a consulting company, Alvarez and Marsal. Responding to Ms. Wattleton will be Dr. Marcela Micucci, who is a scholar of gender and women's history. As you've heard, she is currently here on the curatorial staff as the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow. Her PhD is from Binghamton University, and her research there sounds fascinating and is completely perfect for this evening, looking at the problem of unwanted pregnancy for women in antebellum New York. She has also, as well as her involvement with the suffragette exhibition, she has just finished a case on the birth control movement for the Activist New York Gallery here. Many of the materials in that actually came from the Academy collections. So when you're visiting again, I hope you can see those. Tonight promises to be a really enriching conversation. I look forward to sharing it with you. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Wattleton to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, which I'm not sure that I fully deserve, but it feels really terrific to have the support of the museum and for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be with you this evening. I look forward to our conversation after I make a few prepared remarks. And mindful that I'm in a museum, and museums are historical monuments to the artifacts of the past, I wanted to make a few comments before we sit and chat about the history of reproductive rights in our country, one that is replete with ups and downs, one that we seem determined to repeat the past, one in which, in spite of it all, women have made enormous progress. I'm delighted that also my partner in dialogue and conversation will probably be able to fill in some of the blanks, because I'm only going to highlight there has been so much that has happened over the past century plus of reproductive rights advancements for women that it would be impossible for me to cover it this evening, and it would bore you to tears. But it's wonderful reading, and I suggest that when there is an opportunity that you are able to take a look at some of the developments, because they are instructive to the progress for women and the continuing challenge to women's reproductive health, but fundamentally to women's role and status in our society. I called a couple of my friends who give public lectures frequently, and I said, I want to open with some humor, and my jokes are kind of old and stale, and I've given speeches for a lot of years, and I don't want to bore my audience. And they said, we don't have any more jokes because this is really a challenging time. And so just start off and just jump in. And so I'm going to just jump in to talk to you about this subject. As I said, this is a highlight speech that we can get into a little bit more in our conversation. But the real essence of the reproductive rights movement that embraced women with respect to our ability to be fully sexual and to control our reproduction, believe it or not, started more than a century ago. The seeds challenging reproductive rights were likewise planted more than a century ago. In 1873, Anthony Comstock. Now, we have had our Jerry Falwells, and we have had our Pat Robertsons, and we have had folks who believe that their morality is more sanctified than any of our standards and our values. But Mr. Comstock, as has been the case in the 20th century America, decided that birth control information was pornographic and immoral. And so he went about attempting and successfully seeing the enactment of the criminalization of publication, distribution, and possession of information about birth control. Those were known as the Comstock laws. They were punishable, they were criminal. And as I take you through a little bit of a history of the reproductive rights movement, I hope that you will see the threads that have linked today's battles with the battles of more than a century ago. Those were the days in which information, simply possessing the information, could result in a criminal charges against you with a 5-year imprisonment and a $2,000 fine to pay for the possession of it. Abortion was illegal largely because of the opposition of the medical establishment. The American Medical Association had worked very hard in the 18th century to make certain that abortion was illegal because it was a reflection of their desire not to lose the capacity to provide the service because it was so enriching and so such an economic powerhouse for them. During that time, services to poor women were almost non-existent. Now, here is again another element that strings through from the 19th century to the 20th century and now to 2017. The people who will be hurt the most by the challenges to reproductive rights as women now possess them will be poor women. It was true then, and it is true at the beginning of the 21st century. And during that time, services for poor women were virtually non-existent. Methods for preventing unintended and mistimed births were the barrier methods, the diaphragm, the pessary. These were all related to the act of sexuality. They were not separate and did not empower women to take control of their reproduction independent of conducting or engaged in sexual activity. That went on for a while, but as is the case, human beings who are repressed will rebel and will fight back. And so in the early part of the 20th century, there was a group of women that came to follow a woman known as Margaret Sanger, and they founded what is now known as the modern birth control movement. They were determined to openly distribute information about pregnancy prevention and sexuality. They were repeatedly jailed, they were repeatedly reviled, and they repeatedly went to court to challenge their jailings and the charges against them. And in the course of it, the courts came to their point of view. Public opinion began to turn to support them. Again, the lessons planted in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, must continue to inform this battle through the 21st century. Now, I know that I'm in a museum and an institution, and I was told in the green room that we're not a partisan organization, so let me have a disclaimer right here and now. This is not a talk about how terrible the people who want to undermine reproductive rights are. This is really a challenge for us to continue as a nation to preserve the right and the choice for every woman, every man to make that decision for themselves without the government interfering. And so that is what is the essence of the battle and the struggle that we are engaged in, even in 2017. By mid-20th century, moving right along, there was the advent of oral contraception that came about as a result of private funding that was engineered by Mrs. Sanger. It advanced beyond the barrier method, and for the first time, women had an opportunity to practice birth control independent of the sexual act, as I mentioned earlier, to time their reproduction, to underscore and to create a security of the ability to pursue education and economic opportunities. The technology opened a revolution in contraceptive technology that is still with us today with ever-improving methods of pregnancy prevention. Well, I'm kind of sorry for you guys because that revolution has not touched men, except maybe the Viagra revolution. But there is always hope that male reproductive control will likewise advance beyond barrier methods. So we also saw mid-century and the development that most often gets attention, the Judicial Revolution. Now, as often happens, public behavior precedes laws and opinions from the bench. And such was the case, has been the case with reproductive rights as well. It has only been since 1965, that married couples in this country were deemed sufficiently protected by the Constitution to practice birth control as a right of constitutional privacy. Only in our lifetime has this right been established and recognized by the court. It has only been 1972 when the right of unmarried couples to practice birth control was protected or was recognized by the Supreme Court. And of course, the law that gets the most attention, Roe v. Wade, handed down in 1973, really lit the fire of opposition to the progress that was and continues to be made, giving women and men, but mostly women, the powers to control their reproduction. Now, I want to take a second or two to describe a little bit the construct of Roe v. Wade, because Roe v. Wade and the way in which the Supreme Court framed it has given rise to what we now see as a methodical effort to take it apart and using the construction of the 1973 decisions to undermine the basic right. The court said that in the first trimester, the state cannot involve itself in the protection, and it has no compelling interest in preventing a woman from terminating a pregnancy. In the second trimester, in the woman's interest, and you might notice I use the word woman, not mother, in the woman's interest, the state may regulate and may direct the regulatory authorities the circumstances under which pregnancy termination can take place. Remember this fact because it really is, embedded in that particular provision are the regulatory harassments that are now on the front pages and in the newspapers over and over again throughout the country. In the third trimester, the court ruled that the potential for life might in fact attract state interest, but never, and that is to protect it, but never if a woman's health or life are jeopardized. In all circumstances, the woman's well-being is preeminent and must be given priority. The counter-revolution after Roe v. Wade has taken form in many, many ways. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that and then say what we are facing today and what we need to do about it. Well, right after Roe v. Wade, all women had access to legal and safe reproductive health services, including pregnancy termination. That was until 1980, when the Hyde Amendment was upheld by the Supreme Court. And this was the first time in which we saw the tension between the judiciary and the legislature, in which the court held that if Congress wants Medicaid to pay for pregnancy termination, then it is of the responsibility for Congress to make that public policy, not the courts. And so it upheld the Hyde Amendment, which cut off federal funding for low-income women's pregnancy terminations, except in the cases of life, rape, and incest. Life, rape, and incest is a compelling concept for many people who may be somewhat uncomfortable about this issue. I always find that, however, curious, because those who want to turn back the clock somehow find those conditions acceptable. So if life begins at conception, then it is life begins at conception, to be consistent, that would be not challenged at any point in a woman's pregnancy. But if you find permissible that there are conditions that it's acceptable, then there is a matter of let us contemplate why your rules are okay and a woman's individual circumstances must be challenged and prohibited or restricted and prohibited. There came upon us in the early 80s, likewise, a very regressive political environment. Now, there's a lot of conversation about how great Ronald Reagan was. There are a lot of common themes in the Trump administration that were very much a part of the early policies of the Reagan years. Keep in mind, it is unlikely that Reagan would have been elected had it not been for the moral majority, the Christian right, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, and other regressive forces. But the coalition of those powerful organizations made it possible to capture the Republican Party and to turn the party in the direction that it has gone over the last more than 30 years. Their first announcement, I was president of Planned Parenthood at the time, was we must defund the left. This country must swing back in its public policies and its fiscal appropriations to the right wing and to limited government and less engagement of government in people's lives and addressing the issues of common citizens. Well, guess who was first on the line to be attacked for a defunding? Planned Parenthood. Sound familiar in 2017? We encountered also regulatory challenges. There was the squeal rule where we were supposed to report to parents when we provided prescription drugs for their girls because there are no prescription drugs for boys. There was the Gag Rule. There was every regulatory effort made to restrict access to contraception. And this was after the development of new methods of contraception. This was after the expansion, major expansion under the Great Society and beyond of services for low-income women, for teenagers. We are reaping the benefit of those investments right now as the clock is being squeezed backward. And this was a time in which the attacks were incessant. Efforts were made to form a movement to amend the Constitution to overturn Roe v. Wade. Efforts were made every year to pass a so-called Human Life Amendment and to appropriate funds that would end the availability of safe pregnancy termination. Efforts were made to roll back the services for low-income women and for teenagers in federally funded clinics. They were unable to mount a movement for a constitutional amendment to return or to reverse Roe v. Wade. And so what do we have now? We live with the legacy of state-by-state battles because of the lack of success in the early 80s of a constitutional amendment ban. The effort was made to take it apart piece by piece, state by state. During these years, there was a great deal of mischief about let's go do this around the world. And so in 1983, the Reagan administration announced that the US government would no longer provide international support for organizations that with their own funds, not with U.S. funds, because the Helms Amendment denied the use of U.S. funds for pregnancy termination, even though it is the leading, illegal abortion is the leading cause of maternal mortality in developing countries. But in 1983, the Reagan administration announced that it would no longer provide or allow the U.S. to provide funding for organizations that with their own funds provided even counseling or information for a woman to seek these services. It was known as the GAG, the International Gag Rule. We'll come back to that in a few minutes when we talk about where we are today. So where are we? I could go on and give you an example. The technology is available. It is ever expanding. Women have greater choices than ever before. The services were expanded. Women had more access to reproductive health services, women's health services, prevention services than ever before. And the good news is that in spite of the political, the judicial, and the religious backsliding, and just plain old mean-spirited attacks on women, the choices to prevent unintended and mistimed pregnancies have never been greater. 6+ million women in this country will access reproductive services this year. Reduction in teenage pregnancy is the lowest that it has been in 80 years. Reduction in abortion practice, even in states where there have been no restrictions, is lowest than it has been since Roe v. Wade. Cutting funding from Planned Parenthood has been an annual trope. And I spoke to Cecile Richards today, and I said, give me the latest and the most up-to-date news on what's going on right now in D.C. And she said, you know, that reconciliation bill over which they have been fighting related to the debt ceiling, well, they're not going to be able to defund Planned Parenthood through that because it requires a 60% vote, and they can't get it. However, before we get too happy about that, let us consider the neverthelesses. Judicial rulings have permitted an erosion of Roe v. Wade. And if I leave you with anything here tonight, while it is true that we have made enormous progress and we have shifted the battle in many ways forward, there has been a tremendous amount of backsliding. And while we have complacently assumed that Roe v. Wade continues to exist, let me tell you it does not. It does not in many states around the country. It does not in the state of New York. There are 10 major abortion restrictions that the courts have sanctioned as being permissible to be enacted at the state levels. And I'd like to just take a minute and read them to you because I think they are a sobering obituary to some degree for the death, this very slow demise of Roe v. Wade that must be turned around. Requiring a waiting period after consulting in a clinic. Now, you know, I always have found that kind of curious. Why do women need to be sent home to think about what they want to do with their bodies? Why is it that it can't be assumed that a woman's judgment should be trusted on the strength of her request for that service? But this is one of the regulatory allowances that the court has made. Mandating a non-medically indicated ultrasound test of the fetus before the pregnancy termination, banning Medicaid funding except in cases of the life of the woman being endangered, rape or incest, as I mentioned earlier, restricting coverage in private health plans. This is a major battleground right now. Imposing medically inappropriate restrictions on medically induced termination. requiring onerous and unnecessary requirements on the physical facilities. Remember in Roe v. Wade, I said earlier that in the second trimester, the court found it permissible to regulate the practice and the circumstances of the pregnancy termination, and imposing an unconstitutional ban before viability. I take, and in the conversation that I will have with Marcela a little bit in a few minutes, I often found it necessary to reflect on some of the statements and the early positions of those who have come before us and on whose shoulders all women stand, regardless of their views about women's reproductive rights. But the founding of the modern birth control movement was led by this: that children should be conceived, and I quote, "Children should be conceived in love, born of the mothers," and I'm quoting directly, but I would have used woman's conscious desire, and only begotten under conditions which render possible the heritage of health. Forces hostile to that simple notion really cannot be allowed to pull the levers of power to turn back the gains that women have made. And yet that is what we confront today, almost 100 years later, or more than 100 years later, since the enactment of the Comstock laws to turn back the clock. So what is ahead precisely? Well, with the appointment of the new administration, we have a lot of new characters. I heard a lot from Cecile today about the gag rule, the domestic gag rule. Well, this was, again, a repeat of the international gag rule that I spoke about earlier, Mexico City, that would not allow federal U.S. government funds to be used in organizations that, with their own funds, gave women information about safe pregnancy termination. The domestic gag rule followed under the George Herbert Walker Bush administration that sought to impose those restrictions on U.S. citizens. It was blocked and ultimately reversed by the Clinton administration. And yet the domestic gag rule is a gag rule that I was told today will be very, very hard to prevent. Planned Parenthood is target. That goes without saying. Removal of contraceptives from the required benefits portion of insurance plans will be another front, or is another front. And the broader interpretation of conscientious objections will be permitted by the leaders in HHS. There will be increased requirements for the security of services, which will make them almost unreachable because of the expense by many low-income women. And of course, the defunding Planned Parenthood campaign goes on. Today, we don't see the violence that was a part of the latter part of the 20th century opposition to reproductive rights. That resulted in over 26 shootings and 11 deaths as a result of the killings in the clinics. Those came about at the end of a long stream of bombings, burnings, violence, and attacks on contraceptive clinics and clinics in which women were attempting to peacefully access, protected by the Constitution, and guided by their free will and the circumstances of their personal life. And so I'm often asked, even though I'm no longer president of Planned Parenthood, what can be done? It's just me, just one person. What can I do? What can we do? We now have an administration. What can we do to prevent the backsliding and the gradual erosion? Well, I look at Senators Collins and Mikulski and what they did individually to prevent the defunding of services was pretty remarkable. And so we need to support those members of Congress and members of state legislatures that really take a stand for preserving the right of choice and the right to safe medical procedures for women and for women's health. Our sexual health is as vital to our health as any other essence of our humanity. If not for those two women, joined by Senator Murray, it is likely that there would have been a significant erosion with respect to the inclusion of birth control in the Affordable Care Act. So it is really up to us to make sure that our members of Congress and our members of the state legislatures understand that they will be held accountable if they don't protect these gains of access for women. Cecile tells me today that the reason that those senators were willing to stand up is that women called in unprecedented numbers. I know that many of you were at the Women's March the day after inauguration. I was there. It was just a wonderful experience to see, but how unnecessary that it should be at the beginning of the 21st century that we have to march in the streets in the same way that the 20th century early birth control movement advocates had to march in the streets and suffer. What will go on in New York? I was amazed and stunned when I took a look at the New York situation. You know, I was the president of Planned Parenthood for many years, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Prior to that, I ran a local Planned Parenthood chapter. I ran the chapter during the years when the New York abortion law was reformed. It was one of the leaders and really one of the harbingers for Roe v. Wade. And New York became kind of the capital of the country for these services. Everyone flocked here. So when people say that let's make sure that the states hold on, well, think about the notion that your geographic location will define whether your constitutional protections are preserved. Such was the case when New York reformed its law, even though a year later, by a single vote, it almost repealed the law. But New York's law is not consistent with Roe v. Wade. It does not meet the Roe v. Wade standards. The current law is surprisingly, less favorable to women than it should be. And so I urge you to work in the state of New York for the Reproductive Health Act that will align the laws of the state of New York with Roe v. Wade. I urge you to work for the passage of the Comprehensive Contraceptive Coverage Act, because in the fulsome of all of these services, prevention, prevention, prevention must be in the forefront of all that we work for. And in so doing, I am reminded that Margaret Sanger left us with this particular statement, that no woman can ever call herself free who does not control her own body. And then there was a man who spoke up for women. W.E.B. Du Bois was a great supporter of reproductive rights. And he reminded us that the cost of liberty is less than the price of oppression. Let us not pay that price. Let us value this liberty, and let us work to preserve it and move the status of women to where we should be, which are fully equal citizens of our society. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I've got some wires up here.
So just so everyone is with us, my name is Marcela. I am going to be leading kind of a brief question and answer session, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. Obviously, as many of you heard from my introduction, I do study women and gender history, and I'm also very well-versed, especially given my research in unwanted pregnancy. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. It was really riveting and fantastic. And also, I should say, I have to applaud you on trying to sum up reproductive rights history in such a short time, especially given the recent case that I curated at Activist New York on the birth control movement. I know just how difficult that is, so hats off to you. And although we did have a great speech just now, I would kind of like to transition more into discussion of your personal and lived experiences as the president of Planned Parenthood. In your talk, you did say that Roe v. Wade was kind of what lit the fire in many ways in New York and also nationally. So I guess my first question really for you is, as the president of Planned Parenthood, amidst what I would consider maybe a more controversial period in women's reproductive rights history, given the aftermath of Roe v. Wade and all of the attempts to defund Planned Parenthood and these various challenges to women's reproductive rights. I'm just wondering what it really meant to you to kind of be a leader of Planned Parenthood in this period. I know, it's a tough question.
Well, first of all, I think it's reasonable to maybe introduce you to a little bit of who I am.
Absolutely.
And when I became president, I had no idea why the organization did this, but I was only 33 when I became president of Planned Parenthood. But I had run a local chapter of Planned Parenthood, but I suppose most of my background that would be considered surprising is my mother was a right-wing religious minister. And so I grew up with a born-again fundamentalist religious background. And I was, in her mind, that I always wanted to be a nurse. I have 2 degrees in nursing and I have a master's in midwifery. I always wanted to be a nurse, and so her ambition was that I would become a missionary and go abroad and, proselytize. I think probably if I had chosen a career in teaching, I might have ended up going abroad and proselytizing, but I chose nursing and it gave me a different view of the world. And so I was trained at Ohio State, and my master's is from Columbia, and I trained for midwifery at Harlem Hospital, and during those years of training, or the year and a half of training, I was able to see the effects of women not having access, particularly poor women, not having access to reproductive health care, including illegal abortion. And so my personal experiences informed my leadership. It was, some have said, well, there was a great deal of violence during those years. There was a lot of picketing, a lot of public attacks on clinics. As you heard in my prepared remarks, there were shootings. 11 people ultimately have died in clinics. My personal life was very often a subject of needing protection. But it never occurred to me as president to compromise, because I didn't know what there was to compromise about. And there is sort of this notion that we need to find common ground in this dialogue. Well, just what would that be? What would we say if we said, listen, what we've worked for is that you will have a choice, you will be guided by your views. If you don't want to practice contraception, let us help you to bring healthy children into the world. If you don't want a terminate an unintended or mistimed pregnancy, let us help you to terminate that. And if you want to continue it, let us make sure that all circumstances are cared for. I was trained as a midwife. My background is in healthcare. And so it meant to me that I had the obligation, because I had the privilege of seeing what happens in women's lives that were not the picture of my life, very circumscribed and very limited life. You know, there was no dancing, there was no movies, no smoking, no drinking, because we were all going to heaven, in which we were gonna dance on golden streets. It's kind of a nice gig if you can get away with it, but and maybe this is just simply is my temperament, that I simply could not speak and give voice to what I had seen and heard. And so that really informed my leadership.
That's actually a really great segue into my next question, too, so I appreciate that. A lot of my research is focused on women's reproductive rights history, and one of the women who I've been reading a lot, and actually is a little plug for our next lecture series, is Jennifer Nelson, who will be speaking on October 5th, if anyone wants to come back and see some more. But she writes a book on women of color in the reproductive rights movement, and it's really a fascinating work. And a lot of what she argues is that the reproductive experiences for women of color were very different than the reproductive rights kind of movement for white women. Primarily, especially for many of you who might not know, she's basically arguing that while white women were primarily fighting for the right to choose and the right to have an abortion, that many women of color in this period were actually fighting for the alternative. They actually wanted the right to have children and to kind of avoid being involuntarily sterilized, among other things. So as the president of Planned Parenthood and as a woman of color, how did you engage in these issues and debates? How relevant were they to your time as president?
Well, first of all, I did not try to shy from the fact that women of color have been abused and subjugated to research practices that were unconscionable, but that is a feature of both our ethnicity, but more likely our economic status, because poor women have been subjected to abuses. Poor white women have been subjected to abuses as well. However, I don't think that I have spoken for many years that abuse, the justification for ending abuse, does not mean that there should be a limitation on the choices of any woman, whether she be of color or not. And so this is really a fight for all women, and that's why what has gone on in the past, really, the rebellion really got underway in the last quarter of the 20th century, and the fact that we really are into the 21st century fighting the battles of a century in which the people who are going to suffer the most will be women of color, because we still are disproportionately poor and disadvantaged. So this ought to be framed always as an individual matter. No individual woman should be abused, regardless of her ethnicity or her social status. And that's what the battle is about. The ability to have children, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, to bring children into a healthy environment ought to be a universal ambition for everyone. And timing pregnancy and timing the birth of a baby is very crucial to the ability to bring a child into a healthy environment. And so again, the misery of forcing a woman to continue a pregnancy against her will is something that really flies in the face of every woman, especially for women who don't have the resources to overcome an unintended pregnancy if they're forced to continue the pregnancy to birth.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more. I know that time is moving rather quickly, so I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience as well. So I guess just maybe a sum-up question, some of which I think you've already touched on, but what would you consider to be your most significant accomplishment Not necessarily even just as the president of Planned Parenthood, but also just in your activist career more generally?
Well, I guess just endurance.
From questions like that.
I have a daughter, and I'm pretty proud of her. And I for those who may have concluded that I was, sort of this feminist, man-hating, non-children loving person. My friends, and I see some of them in the audience, can certainly attest that I am the mother of all mothers. And so I'm especially proud of Felicia's accomplishments. But I'm especially proud of a sense that I have tried to requite the honors that I have been given to serve. And I think that sometimes when we have been given a great deal, we feel less the obligation to serve and greater the comfort to say, let them get theirs. And the fact that I was able to give voice on a platform and continue. I mean, I can't believe it. I left Planned Parenthood 20 years ago, that somebody still wants to hear what I have to say or think about this. Is something that I feel is really a significant personal accomplishment, but I hope it's an accomplishment for all women.
It is. Let me just be the one to tell you it is. It's just such an honor to even be on the stage with you, so it's much appreciated. I do want to now transition over to the audience so that we have some time to do a little Q&A. Again, I'm just going to reiterate Whitney's earlier remarks that we do ask that you wait for a museum staff member to come and hand you a microphone, and then we'll call on you and ask your question. And obviously, for time's sake, we also request that you keep your questions at least relatively brief so that we can accommodate as many audience members as possible. And just if we do at any point ask you to wrap up your question, which is doubtful, but if it happens, just please kindly return the microphone to the museum staff and we'll
Don't
move
toss
along.
it at me.
So do we have questions?
The power of the microphone. Hi, I'm Ann Stars. I'm the president of the Guttmacher Institute, which some of you may know does a lot of the research on reproductive health. Wow, thanks everybody. And so I wanted to ask Faye your perspective on a question that we're getting asked a lot these days, which is what is the value, what is the research of evidence in the current political climate, particularly around this issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights? You are probably familiar with the research that Guttmacher has done that shows the invaluable and irreplaceable role that Planned Parenthood has played in providing services to, in particular, low-income and disadvantaged women in this country, showing that in many counties, Planned Parenthood is the only provider or the main provider of reproductive health services, and also showing, and I think this doesn't get enough credit, that Planned Parenthood provides higher quality services than any other federally funded provider of services, appointments that are available late in the day, short notice, full range of contraceptive methods. Anyway, it's all on our website, guttmacher.org. You can go look. But we get this question a lot. What is the importance, when evidence and statistics don't matter to policymakers? What do we do?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for being the president of the Guttmacher Institute, affiliated with Planned Parenthood, and to acknowledge that the appreciation for the research and the balanced and nonpartisan research that the Guttmacher Institute uses. I tapped into quite a bit of it to prepare for this and to brush up for this conversation, so I thank you for that. It really is, research is really important, and in the leadership that I tried to provide as a president of Planned Parenthood, it really was the foundation of the work that we did. It didn't matter that and here again it was another example of the assault. Under the Reagan policies, a lot of data was shut down. A lot of data collection was shut down. And if you want to kill a program, kill the information about the program. And so that's another tactic that I did not get into. And so the importance of independent research becomes even more crucial to continuing to make the case. But in my leadership, I relied a great deal on that kind of research because people know when you're a flim-flam artist, if you don't have anything to say but your point of view and you don't have the statistics and the data to back it up, the evidence, you know, that's a term that is now being thrown around in professional circles, evidence-based practices. You really find your impact to be quite limited. So the Guttmacher research and others who did research, but you certainly are the leaders in this regard. The work may not have been heard by those people who don't want to hear the truth, and we have to accept that. But we have to continue to project the truth. And many of you may have seen my television debates. Very often those debates were informed by the research and by the data, so that I was able to make a compelling argument to the people for why these policies cannot be allowed to be enacted or to stand. So I don't think we should be discouraged about that. You know, I used to go to Congress and I used to say Guttmacher said that for every dollar invested in family planning, the government saves 4. That was a snore. It was completely ineffective. Okay? But saying that over and over and over again to citizens who need to make the case to their members of Congress and holding them accountable for responsible fiscal policies with regards to women's health, it becomes a very vital tool. So it's you know, none of this stuff is easy. I just gave you a presentation about more than a century of the same thing over and over and over again. And so we have to have that kind of same thing determination to keep doing that work, because there are fewer unintended pregnancies. There are fewer pregnancy terminations. Now, you know, part of that may be that the atmosphere is such that women are choosing not to terminate pregnancy. But I'd like to believe that it also has to do with the fact that the attitudes are changing. Sex education is more broadly available. A lot of that had to do with research, that we're more successful in really controlling reproduction. And it's a very complex fabric that has to be woven and maintained, and research is really vital and core to that effort.
Question?
Hello, I'm a midwife. So we have admired you for a long time, as you know. So in my role as a midwife, right now in the last few years, genetic screening and testing has just exploded. And one of the restrictions you didn't mention was not having an abortion for any genetic cause, which is Mike Pence's state of Indiana. I don't know if you all know that. Okay, and Louisiana as well, where my sister lives, and works with children who are born with serious birth defects. It's a real bind for us clinicians. I figure if I lived in Louisiana, would I offer the test that I offer to my women in Manhattan? Because we now can find out who carries genetic diseases, whether or not both partners carry it. We've had a baby die from one of these genetic diseases. We have another baby who's deaf from one of these genetic diseases. But how do we approach that, since it's always about protecting the life of the mother, but not necessarily protecting the life of an innocent being who will have a miserable life if they're born?
Well, we're protecting the life of the woman. If she has not delivered, she's not a mother. She is a woman. And I think that what you have shown the light on is the trap of defining these issues state by state. The question is this a fundamental right of all American women to make these decisions?
And we have a great deal of fragmentation as a result of the strategy that has been employed for now almost 30 years because of a lack of effectiveness to make a broad reversal of the constitutional protections. So I suppose my view would be that, you know, first of all, Mr. Pence is not the king. Let him just be a reminder of how bad it can get if we are not active and if we are not engaged. Let us not be in denial that these things cannot happen. Cecile rained down on me. I was sorry. I'm gonna, you know, okay, Cecile, I called you, but I got 5 emails this afternoon as a result of it. Telling me all the terrible things, all the terrible people that are now in place in the agencies and what they will now be able to do. But that should not discourage us any more than you know, the imposition of prohibitions and the limitation of data. Let's find another way to tell that story. I mean, my own experience with abortion, with the abortion experience, occurred when I was at Ohio State in nursing and training to be a nurse. And in that case, the woman was carrying, and she was 7 months, and it was well before Roe v. Wade, I assure you. It was in the 60s, and she had a kidney infection. And the question was, she was the wife of a resident, and the question was whether she would survive the pregnancy because of the enormous burden on her kidneys as a result of you're the nurse midwife, you know, of the increased blood volume. And because she had the circumstances of being at a medical center and her husband was a doctor, her pregnancy was terminated. That's not about viability or an abnormality, an anomaly is the word I'm looking for, with the fetus, but it really does speak to another area that I did not touch on, and that's this late-term abortion that makes everybody squishy and squeezy about whether we shouldn't, you know, isn't that the more difficult? And the point is, if there is any area of pregnancy that we should defend, it's the defense of when a woman identifies that she is carrying a fetus that has no potential for a decent quality of life or any life. I mean, who on earth believes that a woman should be forced to carry a fetus to term when it is identified to be anencephalic? And very often you can't identify those anomalies until it's well into the pregnancy. I have never met a woman who decided at 7 months, I want to have an abortion. I think I'm going to go just have an abortion today. And yet those are the women, those are the circumstances, those are the examples of the situations that are the most difficult for the people involved in them, and that are the most necessary to be conducted in privacy without the imposition of the government, and with the doctor and with the physician and with the people who guide the woman in her decision. So I suppose that debate of fetal anomalies and their compatibility with life will be ones that will be under attack. You know, that just simply, it also flies in the face of the disability movement to say somehow we're not valued. That's not true. The question is whether the quality of life can be provided in a way that they too have a decent life expectancy. So, you know, what I have said today, I hope doesn't sound like I believe that these are simplistic issues and they are cut and dried and we have a simple answer for everything. What I've said is we don't have a simple answer for everything, and that's why the government should stay out of it.
Any other questions? Yeah?
So I'd like to follow up on what you've just said, sort of through the whole thing, and that is 2 questions. Why do you think that we have allowed or that the other side has really won the language debate? And so why is the pro-choice community always finding itself on the defensive and never on the offense. And I think that what you talked about in terms of late term is a perfect example of that, where they really started by talking about the made-up term of partial birth abortion. And so the pro-choice community were always playing catch-up in really trying to redefine what our issues are and really getting people to understand them. And I think that also what you said in your own prepared remarks was really they were wonderful and very instructive, and that is, you hardly used the term, maybe only 3 times, abortion. But you talked about health, you talked about women's rights, you talked about a lot of things that a lot of people can identify with and understand. How do we change the conversation?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think we're on the defensive. I think in my talk, I talked about all of the progress that we've made in spite of all of this. I mean, you know, I talked about the advances in technology. I talked about the fact that we really do still have control. It is being undermined and weakened, but more women are contracepting than ever before. Unintended pregnancy is down. Teenage pregnancy is at an all-time low. There's a lot of evidence that we have made tremendous progress, and we live in a country in which there is free speech and people can say whatever they want to about you, and they do. The proof of the pudding is that those services are still provided in spite of the dangers that clinic professionals encounter. In spite of all that I have laid before you, we have continued to make progress. But social progress is not necessarily finite or permanent. And so the pendulum swings back. The opposition, some of you are here to remember David Garth. And in the early days of my presidency, I sought his counsel of Planned Parenthood. I said he was a political consultant. At that time, he was considered the guru of political consultants. And at that time, I sought his counsel about what Planned Parenthood should do about its political opposition. And he said, what you have to do, what you have to recognize is that you have created, the pro-choice movement has created a revolution. And absolutely, there's going to be a counter-revolution. It's unavoidable, and that's where we are. There has been progress. Now there has been erosion. We have to continue the progress. I have never felt that I was on the defensive. I have always felt that I was the champion of the people who needed to be spoken for. So I think that one of the things is that we need to get our heads in the right place. We cannot cover over. And if I didn't use the word very often, in my talk, it wasn't because I was consciously avoiding it. But I have not heard anybody wanting to make illegal pap smears and breast exams. And so the notion that we can somehow defend what is under attack and what the essence of the issue is with those particular buffers is, I think, a fool's journey. What we must, I believe, continue to frame is that these services, and we shrink not from any of them, are a part of a holistic way of women's health, and her reproductive health is very core to her being. Not that, well, but if these services go away, where are the women going to get their breast exams? Well, women will get, nobody is going to outlaw their breast exams. And so I think we really fool ourselves if we really think that that's a defensive posture, I really believe, that somehow mitigates or somehow makes more acceptable this term, abortion, that still, even in our own minds, is a bit tawdry, in which we should stand tall and stand proud to say that when a woman needs to terminate her pregnancy, she should do so under safe and informed circumstances, not because she's in a crime. I didn't mean to proselytize there a bit. Anyway, I think we've made tremendous progress. I really do. And I hope that my prepared remarks did not in any way leave the impression that woe is us. We these are all elements aligned against the progress. But there's a great deal of evidence. I mean, Planned Parenthood serves in medical services, reproductive health services, including breast exams and pap smears, which Cecile loves to talk about, over 2 million people a year. Think about that. It's an organization that just celebrated its 100th anniversary. 2 million people a year, over and over and over again. That's a lot of women in this country that have received those services. We have nothing to defend and everything to be proud for and to fight for, to preserve.
Other questions?
Yes, I'm also a midwife and very proud to count you as part of our sisterhood. You mentioned
there are a lot of sisters in that sisterhood, so I'm not so sure they're all so proud of me.
The ones I know are.
There are a lot of nuns who are nurse midwives.
You mentioned the Reproductive Health Act. Would you clarify for this audience some of the provisions of that act in New York State?
Here I'm a little not as well informed on the details because my work has been largely national, but I did, knowing that this is a New York audience, I did want to take a look at what's going on in New York. And what I found was that the Reproductive Health Act, the current reproductive health law, it would correct it is that abortion is not permissible unless immediately saving the woman's life. After 24 weeks, it's a criminal act, even when necessary for a woman's health or a fetus is not viable. Now, just as the Comstock laws were by and large not enforced, and only in 1997 were the last vestiges of those laws overturned at the behest of Barney Frank. This is something that we've just kind of gone along with and continue to just do and have not been enforced, but it needs to be corrected. I was stunned by how restrictive the language is. And I also found very commendable that the parallel legislative agenda is to advance the Comprehensive Contraceptive Coverage Act, which would block the efforts to eliminate contraceptives from health plans and the various strategies in that. I mean, some of these things are like swarming bees. They come at you from every which direction. And by the way, I think that that's further evidence of their losing strategy, if no other reason than that women and men, to the limits that men have, really continue with their daily lives to practice control of their fertility. The question is, are they going to be harassed? Will they be able to continue to do so with the best methods in the most informed way? Or will there be restrictions that are harder and harder to get? And who's going to suffer the most? It's not going to be you and me. And so if we go forth from this room this evening, let us take that responsibility that it's not you and me. And it's only when it comes to us that we get really excited about it. But we need to be excited about it for the least of us, because they are the ones in the front lines that will be most impacted by these laws.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, it's right here. Front here.
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. I think you have fulfilled the role of a missionary, and I want to thank you very much.
Great. Well, I want to thank Faye Wattleton for coming and joining us here tonight. It's a really very thought-provoking and engaged conversation with Marcela. our Andrew W. Mellon Fellow here. So we hope that many of you will have an opportunity to come back to the Academy of Medicine on October 5th for the More Than Medicine Social Justice and Feminist Movement for Health, as Marcela said, with Jennifer Nelson. So that's on October 5th, and we do have the information for signing up right here. And then also for the museum's Beyond Suffrage exhibition, where we do really do an overview of 100 years of women's rights in New York State. So this was a perfect segue for that exhibition, which will be opening on October 11th. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your work.